it's literally impossible, and we don't even have the tools to track that right now. I mean, it's pieces of paper and a bill of goods, but now there's going to be attestations to, you know, ensuring that, for example, the cobalt didn't come from a conflict area. How do you do that? You put a sticky note on the cobalt as it goes up. So there's a lot of solutions needed for compliance. But by the way, let's not leave out. So California and New York both have sustainability reporting regulation or laws in effect now. They're not quite as stringent as the EU's, but California, for example, if you are a billion-dollar company, $1 billion in revenue, doing business in California, and the definition for doing business, that's exactly what it says. So that's going to be pretty much every billion-dollar company in the U.S. has to report on their scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. So it's already starting in the U.S. And of course, in the U.S., and I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not going to try to pretend to be one, but that's going to allow for that to start creeping into the U.S. Economy and regulatory framework natively. Hey everyone, this is Loren Long with Digital Infrastructure Advisors Limited and Clear Sustainability, and you're listening to the Data Center Go-to-Market Podcast with Joshua Feinberg.
Welcome, Data Center friends. It's Joshua Feinberg, host of the Data Center Go-to-Market Podcast, and I'm thrilled to be welcoming a very special guest joining me today. I'm welcoming Loren Long, who is Managing Director of Clear Sustainability and Director of Sustainability at Dial, Digital Infrastructure Advisors Limited, based out of the UK. Loren, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, Joshua, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be on your podcast.
Well, thanks for agreeing to come on as well. Really looking forward to this. I think a great place to start would be, could you walk me through how you've ended up in your career in this place now where you're considered one of the top thought leaders around sustainability on the planet when it comes to data centers? Was it something you've always thought about throughout the course of your career, or was it something that kind of clicked along the way? Were you dreaming of this when you were in high school or college?
Well, it's interesting. So it's a very circuitous route that was certainly not planned. I actually started in the Army after college, and after 5 years in the Army, I went in actually to telecom, and I spent 10 years in the telecom industry and was very fortunate to do a lot of work in Europe and Asia, lived in Latin America and did business there for a number of years. So, really got an understanding of, how different cultures and how businesses in different cultures operate that helped overall. And then in 2012, a good friend of mine and my co-founder at Dart Points were looking at the data center industry that was talking about huge, massive data centers, which is kind of funny now because they were talking about 100 megawatt data centers, and they were going to put them in the middle of nowhere. And we had just lived through the GPRS to UMTS to 4G evolution in the mobile world. And we're like, why wouldn't you do that with data centers? Why wouldn't you have little data centers everywhere to distribute the load? And so we founded Dart Points. And we were way early because I think about 12 years later, there's still panels that are titled, "Is this the year of the edge finally?" But we sold that to private equity, and I stayed around for a few years helping out. And at that point, it was a decision of what I wanted to do. And the environment has always been very important to me personally. I've always been a student of environmental sciences and the effects of business and manufacturing and society on the environment, at which point I decided that's what I wanted to do professionally, is to take my background and turn it into that. So invested a lot of time, went back to school to even get a greater holistic understanding of the Sustainable Development Goals, how it applies to the global South, the inner workings and interconnectedness of it all, to get a greater understanding of sustainability from outside just an industry standpoint. And at that point then founded Clear Sustainability. And we are focused on demystifying the regulations, the regulatory requirements, but also helping companies understand what the consequences are financial, reputational, and legal for the existing and upcoming sustainability regulations.
It's super fascinating because I see quite a few people that are mid-career, probably what most would consider Gen X, that did something early on in college or early on in their career that set the stage for all of this, myself included. I was actually an econ major in college. I remember taking environmental economics. I remember taking an applied psych class where we read Robert Cialdini on how to motivate like hotel guests to not put their linens for cleaning all the time. So like planning, I see this a lot where people that were in like financial analysts or economist roles that ultimately ended up in some part of sustainability and digital infrastructure. Really, really interesting.
Okay, so you're saying that all the hangers in the hotel bathrooms are your fault? Do you really need this towel?
Yeah. So yeah, no, it's really interesting is that you're still trying to influence people's behaviors and influence, and now it's just through the lens of digital infrastructure, which is the remote control over our personal, our professional lives.
Yes.
Smartphones, streaming, and huge impact. Because I think all too often in the course of larger companies where they're trying to not only hit their KPIs, but hit shareholder returns, thinking long-term is tough.
Well, it is. And there's, I was going to, with all of the clients and entities that I engage with, there's always a tug of war. And, it's the dilemma between, being profitable and being sustainable. And that's just, it's the reality of it. And, I'm fortunate that being in boutique firms, I don't necessarily have a corporate message to uphold. I feel like I can actually say, just, no, this is actually how it is. And we have a lot of challenges. I think there's a lot of brilliant people doing a lot of innovative things. But overall, I think, there's a bifurcation in the industry right now. And when it comes to sustainability specifically, and in Europe, it's regulated. The Code of Conduct and the Climate Neutral Data Center Pact influenced what has now become several of the regulations, but it's regulated. It's regulated. It's now reported against. Whereas I think in the U.S., minus those operators that are operating in Europe that have to follow those regulations as well, it's still viewed as an aspirational idea. It's come on, we can do it. And they haven't quite made the switch to, this isn't aspirational anymore. This isn't a feel good. It's not a look at us go, because when you start looking at some of the programs, the things that are done to present their sustainability are disallowed by the regulations and the reporting. So I think that's going to be a challenge.
Yeah. I mean, I'm a couple dozen interviews into this podcast, and it's like night and day, the general themes that come up on both sides of the pond, especially with people that work with operators and technology companies. Sustainability is a very, very strong, predominant theme that we talk about when I'm interviewing people in the UK and in the Nordics and throughout Europe. In the US, it's, right, we're out of power. Where can we build? We can't get power.
Yeah. Yes.
So yeah, for sure.
Yeah,
and
I think it's. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, and it's probably the multinational companies that are operating in both regions that are going to allow the sustainability message to spread faster.
I think that's probably true. I think what we're going to find in the next 18 months is we're going to see a bit, maybe not a backtrack or a rewrite, but a shift in how things are presented, and how certain, call them sustainability accounting methodologies, are used to help. And I'm talking about the virtual carbon markets, virtual PPAs around renewable energy, et cetera. I think you're starting to see a lot more scrutiny on those programs. And for example, the CSRD, which is the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, which comes online next year for some, and then a lot more for the year after that, it doesn't allow offsets of any kind. You have to report your emissions as they are, and then of course you can report it, but you don't get to blend the two and come out with a neat little net zero answer. And I think that's going to be challenging for some people.
Do you envision that as some of the big operators and hyperscalers are pushing a nuclear powered agenda, that it's going to get more people in the US to take sustainability more seriously? Or do you think both go at the same time, full speed ahead?
Wow. That's a great question. Because the nuclear option, we can call it, really doesn't have anything to do with sustainability. Now, it's very fortunate that it is carbon-free emissions. There's scope 3, but we ignore scope 3 in solar and wind too, so we can ignore it in nuclear for the purposes of this discussion. But it's not about that. What we're seeing in states like Virginia, states like Texas, Georgia. By the way, we're also seeing it in Slough. We're seeing it in Amsterdam. We're seeing, Ireland, where you've got governments and utilities saying, stop, I can't do it anymore. You've got the lieutenant governor of Texas was on record, I don't know, 3 or 4 months ago, specifically saying, when we're in session next time, we're going to have to take a serious look at the data center industry, because they're looking at the amount of investment required to get the grid capable of delivering all that power. And they're wondering who's going to pay for this. There's a hearing in Virginia, a technical hearing, and I think it's December 16th, where they are specifically talking about how do they handle, they call them large retail electrical customers. And is there another way? Do we need to change the rate structure? Do we need to change the investment model? So you've got a lot of governmental and policy making entities are now looking at us saying, hold on, we need to change something. And if you go off grid with nuclear, well, then you've answered that. I don't need your grid. I've got my own power. So it's an easy way to continue building without burdening that discussion further. Well, and by the same token, I think the last time I heard, Northern Virginia is 5 to 7 years out for connections. So that obviously very much impacts growth as well.
For sure. And what I've noticed in the last 6 months to a year as well is when I talk to marketers, they're increasingly spending more of their resources on a couple of different categories of external stakeholders. In the same way they educate and build trust with all the normal buyer personas and channel partners that they normally would over the years, they're now external regulators, utility companies, elected officials, all trying to, they're realizing that sponsoring a community fair or a concert series or something like that is nice, but probably not sufficient to be able to have more productive conversations about anything more than just a knee-jerk reaction.
Yeah, and I think there's I'm not going to call it a debate. There's an ongoing discussion in the industry, and if you go to conferences and shows, there will inevitably be that one panel that says, "How do we fix our PR problem?" And when I'm on that panel, my answer is usually no. It's actually always, it's not a PR problem. There's actual problems. And I'm a big proponent of, we need to address how we operate, and simply looking at people and saying, well, don't you like email? Don't you like Netflix? That's not an answer. That's not working with the community. That's not working with policymakers. We need to recognize we use land, we use power, we use water, and it's beyond just the NIMBY. I mean, that's there too. But if you listen to some of the opponents of data center builds, you can separate. There's some that it's a pure NIMBY, and well, okay, we got to build them somewhere, right? And we should. But at the same time, I think some of them are good points that the sooner we address them head on and recognize them, the better off we will be, because we'll now have honest discussions with people.
Yeah. And for sure, there's education that's necessary with the NIMBY idea has been around for decades, but now, okay, you add edge on top of that. You add the need for low latency applications, AI, autonomous vehicles, smart cities. they're on the decentralized versus decentralized for sure on a collision course, and with all of this. And it seems in Scandinavia and in the Nordics, they're thinking about this a lot more in the US, but they have the luxury of a completely different climate restrictions than a huge part of the US as well.
Yeah, well, I joked one time. I was actually at a conference in Iceland, and it was, as you would expect, a number of Nordic companies there, and talking about how geothermal was the way forward. And I jokingly said, well, until we can put a volcano in Northern Virginia, we're going to need other answers. So, that you bring up a great point, and that is when you look at sustainability, even when you just look at construction and operations, what works in Finland or Norway is not going to work in Morocco. And, we can't, we talk about, direct to chip or liquid immersion. We talk about, do we do adiabatic or open? How do we, and we need different answers for different things. We can't just put everything in Finland, although I'm sure the Finns wouldn't mind.
Have a little bit of a latency problem, but for anywhere else except that region of the world. But
right.
So, Loren, you're at the stage in your career where I imagine from time to time, young people, teens, early 20s, they're high school, college, they've heard a little bit about data centers. It's in the mainstream media a lot more than it was 5 or 10 years ago. And imagine a scenario where the son or daughter of a neighbor or coworker, friend or family member approaches you and asks you for advice. They've mentioned they've heard about these careers. They're not really interested in engineering or software development. They're kind of interested in these client-facing roles. What kind of insights would you be able to offer them on what a career path might look like for getting started in this industry?
I think it's very timely. I've had that same discussion a few times in the last week. First off, the data center industry needs everyone. There's not a career specialty we don't need. Now, is it more operationally and engineering focused? It is. But we also need salespeople. We need marketing people. We need HR. We need finance. So there's literally no place, or there's no person or no skill set that isn't applicable. I think that it's a growth industry. It's incredibly exciting. Despite some of the things I said just a minute ago, we do enable amazing things to happen. We create the foundation for technology. We create the ability to innovate, and the things that AI is doing. Some silly, but there's some pretty incredible things that artificial intelligence is bringing. So I recommend to everyone to look at the data center industry. I think one of the challenges, or one of the things that I think we could improve upon, and we talk about it all the time, bringing more talent in. I think we need to create more positions specifically for all those skill sets. We need to open up the positions. We need to recognize more internships, more early graduates, or entry level positions, but they're developmental positions, because that's the other thing about this industry. We cover mechanical engineering, electrical engineering, power, cooling, networking, IT. It's literally the whole world, and it takes a while to learn it all. So it's, programs like CNET, or John Booth just opened the National Data Center Academy here in the UK for hands-on training. Data Center Dynamics has a great program. And I think if we invest more in the education early on, I think it helps people feel more confident to approach our industry.
Yeah, it's super interesting as well, too, because it gets at not only recruiting, but how early on career-wise do you want the opportunity to plant the seeds? Do you want to have someone go all the way through 4 years and then realize that, oh, there's another 6 months to a year of learning curve to go through? Or would you rather intercept someone while they're still in high school, while they're looking for interesting summer jobs or internships starting as early as like when they're 18, 19, 20 years old, and then progressively layer that experience on? And cloud, for example, IBM and Google and AWS for years have had these great certificate programs to try to start to close the gap on some of that. So I imagine some of the larger companies in digital infrastructure, aside from those, can possibly should be investing in all of the above, just depending on where their priorities are.
Yeah, I so often hear people, when you ask them how you got into the data center industry, you'll hear it was by accident. I was going along and all of a sudden, boom, I'm in the data center industry. Schneider Electric, if I'm allowed to talk about companies specifically, they have a great internship program where they will bring in college-age students, and it's not, here's a task, go do it for, 3 months, and all right, thanks, back to school. It's a round robin throughout the organization that literally shows them every part. They may focus in certain areas, but I think that's incredibly valuable, because now you're sending someone back to finish their last year university with an idea. Wow, I got to see all these different parts. That's where I'm going to focus. It not only does it bring them into the industry, but it gets them talking. That's the viral part of that, I think, is very important, especially with the younger generation we're trying to attract.
And Schneider must be doing something right, because I've seen that same program described. And if I remember correctly, too, one of the things that was especially cool about it for people that had the flexibility to do it is they were not only rotating you through different parts of the company, they were rotating you through different countries. So you were spending a couple of weeks or a couple of months living in different regions. I think it was primarily throughout Europe. But yeah, super interesting program.
Yeah, it's a bit of a flex, but they're a big company. So
to pull that all together and create the kind of balanced renaissance Schneider Electric that can really have a deep understanding for the different parts of the ecosystem. I came into this by accident as well. I was working with IT services companies and consulting firms and managed service providers for 15 years or so, and I saw a lot of them struggling making the transition from premise-based to cloud-based, from client server to SaaS. But the ones that were figuring it out had either moved into ERP, moved into custom software development, or co-location. So it was through co-location that I bridged the gap from IT services and managed services over to that on the technology side. But yeah, there needs to be more of these natural paths for how this can happen, so it doesn't just rely on word of mouth. And I think higher education can play a role. I think high schools can play a role. CompTIA for decades has had inroads in a lot of secondary education and colleges. So yeah, there's a lot of opportunities for reaching people in the formative years, so they see that there's more to the tech industry than just getting a job at a Meta or Alphabet or AWS or one of the really well-known FAANG kind of companies.
Yeah, totally agree.
Loren, so that's a fantastic insight for someone that's early on in their career.
The Data Center Go-to-Market podcast is sponsored by DCSMI, elevating the role of sales, marketing, and go-to-market GTM professionals in the growth of the data center industry. To stay informed about upcoming episodes, make sure that you subscribe to the Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter on the DCSMI website that can be found at www.dcsmi.com. Again, that URL is www.dcsmi.com.
What about someone that you may have worked with 10, 15 years ago, and you haven't seen them in a while? You bump into them at a conference. They say, guys, hey, we should get together and catch up. So over the course of having breakfast or lunch or coffee, you realize that they're kind of hit a rut in their career. They've a little bit burned out. They're trying to figure out what their next move should be. What kind of advice would you offer to someone, former coworker, friend you haven't seen in years, on how to get their career back on track on digital infrastructure?
My answer every time will be focus on sustainability, and whether it's doing free courses like on Coursera or going back to school. I think there's industry courses as well. But the effect that sustainability as a whole, and it's growing. More importantly, the regulations that are coming, and I don't think people yet realize what is going to happen in terms of these regulations, and there will be different effects depending on the tier 1 hyperscale level and even at the lower level. And I'll give you an example. And by the way, I'm stealing this all from my business partner, Sarah Peterson, who is a US UK regulatory attorney specializing in these. But there's one coming. It's been voted in, but it hasn't been enacted yet. And it's called the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. What that says, as compared to the CSRD, or the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, that says report on scope 1, 2, 3 environmental impacts such as water, land use, biodiversity, and human rights. So it's take a snapshot, tell us how you did. The CSDDD, as it's called, is tell me how you're getting better. Now, it's not only tell me how you're getting better, but it holds you responsible for your supply chain. And this is going to have huge effects because, and I'll go ahead and give you the next person you should talk to is probably her, because she's much better at explaining this. But think about, contracts are always between two people, right? Party one, party two. But now party one is responsible for party two's upstream suppliers and ensuring that their emissions are correct, their environmental impacts aren't bad, their human rights impacts. That's not currently in the legal system. Contracts aren't written that way right now. And so, one of the topics, and I'm kind of weaving, and I promise I'll come back to your story, is, well, those are European regulations. They're not US or Asia Pac or Latin America. They don't apply. Well, if you're doing business with someone who is operating in Europe, then you're going to have to be reporting to them so that they can comply. If you are doing business with someone who's doing business with someone, you're going to have to report to them and attest to. So these are going to have, it's called extraterritorial jurisdiction. It's going to have an impact throughout the industry. And there's going to be a lot of people needed with expertise in supply chain, legal, contracts, operations, carbon accounting, environmental engineering, to help companies really understand their impacts and report accurately. Because aside from just the reputational embarrassment of, well, you're not as green as you thought you were, there are regulatory fines, which are pretty steep, 5% of annual revenue. And then now we get to the legal side. And is it the supply chain suing one another or bringing lawsuits for inaccurate reports? Or is it governments? For example, if you look at Australia, and they are probably the most legally active right now, and I think the last count was 126 greenwashing lawsuits. And one of them, which goes to what I'm talking about, it was a PE firm that had invested in another firm that had invested in oil and gas. And obviously you can't claim you're a green fund if you've got oil and gas in your portfolio. And they were fined, I think, $12 million because one of their portfolio was oil and gas. So there's going to be a lot more responsibility and liability taken on. And that's, from a career standpoint, that's a lot of opportunity. And it's an incredibly complicated topic. So I would say sustainability.
Yeah, it's fascinating because as you started to explain that, I started to think about GDPR and how that also, the moment you look at your client base, you look at your traffic that's coming to your site and your social media, and you realize how globally connected. It's hard to distance the two. But when you look at the supply chain, and this, you think about 5 or 10 years ago, before sustainability was even on the front burner, people were talking about the location of data center facilities because of governance issues. Now it's way beyond that. And this is how, one of the natural questions I was going to ask you is, how does this get from EU to the US? And you answered the question exactly. It's the moment, it's not just a matter of one of the big operators having facilities and on multiple continents. It's their customers and their partners and their whole supply chain. And it's hard to envision facilities being built without dozens of vendors that are coming from, we're using materials that are literally from all over the globe. including aging?
No, it's literally impossible, and we don't even have the tools to track that right now. I mean, it's pieces of paper and a bill of goods, but now there's going to be attestations to, ensuring that, for example, the cobalt didn't come from a conflict area.
Yeah.
How do you do that? You put a sticky note on the cobalt as it goes up. So there's a lot of solutions needed for compliance. But by the way, let's not leave out. So California and New York both have sustainability reporting regulation or laws in effect now. They're not quite as stringent as the EU's, but California, for example, if you are a $1 billion company, $1 billion in revenue, doing business in California, and the definition for doing business, that's exactly what it says. So that's going to be pretty much every $1 billion company in the US has to report on their scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. So it's already starting in the US. And of course, in the US, and I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not going to try to pretend to be one, but that's going to allow for that to start creeping into the US economy and regulatory framework natively.
And for sure that it makes sense that it's going to filter out throughout the full ecosystem and throughout dozens of different job roles, throughout the dozens of different kind of businesses in the data center ecosystem, across the operators and the tech and the facilities and the construction, and for sure the construction and real estate.
Right.
Loren, when you think about where we're moving as an industry, what do you see as the biggest mistake or biggest oversight that people are making now? Do you think it's just simply that they're completely overlooking the sustainability reporting requirements? I think this is going to catch most people off guard.
No, I don't think they are, because no, and listen, I enjoy friendships with the sustainability experts in a lot of the companies across the world in the data center industry. I think that and they do really, they're passionate sustainability professionals that are trying to make a difference, and so full credit for that. Now, where we differ, and my one of my personal, I don't want to call it a mantra. Maybe it's my dead horse beating is, have you ever heard the phrase, the fix that fails? So essentially, the fix that fails is you fix this thing, but you broke something else. And when you look at sustainability and the complexities behind it, I know a lot of people want to make sustainability simple. It's not simple. It's not even close to simple. And trying to simplify it, I think, leads to other issues. And one of our issues right now is carbon tunnel focus. Carbon, right? Well, if you want to get rid of scope 1 emissions from coal and natural gas, well, solar and wind, right? Okay, but right now we still can't recycle solar panels, and people argue, no, we can recycle 70% of solar panels.
So you're saying 70% of solar panels can be recycled, or 70% can't?
No,
I'm talking about the sustainability.
70% of the solar panel.
Right.
So if you look at the weight, the gross weight of a solar panel, we can recycle 70 to 80% of it. Sometimes even up to 90%. The 10% that we leave out is actually the 10% we need most. And that's what's going to landfill. Right now, the massive blades on wind turbines, they go to landfill. Now, you can make a really long park bench or a really long, shade cover. That's just a landfill that serves a temporary purpose for something else. And then you bring in the lithium batteries, and there's a lot of research right now in other battery chemistries, and actually they're not that old. or I'm sorry, they're not that new. In fact, I saw a presentation yesterday, and the number of batteries, both from a watts per gram, are way better than lithium. Now, lithium is very light, but if you look at lithium extraction, manganese extraction, nickel extraction, those are incredibly damaging environmentally, those processes. And so, it's like, yay, we got rid of the coal. Okay, but now we've got, massive water pollution, chemical pollution, and environmental damage because of the fix that's not quite getting there. And so we need to have a greater holistic, and I think that's where we're missing it. Now, I will, my hat's off to Microsoft for getting 3 Mile Island turned back on. I think that's brilliant. It was a waste that wasn't working or operational. So I think that's fantastic. I know Google just announced that they're working with an SMR. I know Talon Energy with Amazon is doing something as well. And there's other exciting, like a thorium reactor, incredibly exciting, both for the improved safety, the reduction in highly radioactive nuclear waste, the ability for massive distribution. And I'm excited about those coming on. But that's where I think as an industry, sometimes we get a little too focused on a solution that allows us to provide a good report, as opposed to a solution that's actually making sure that we're not breaking anything else.
So it seems that like the first cousin of greenwashing is a lot of people talking about decarbonization, but what they're not talking about is what the trade-offs were necessary to make this decarbonization initiative happen, that are equally or sometimes even bigger implications than what they're solving in the first place. Just that one was easy to measure and one wasn't.
Exactly.
I mean, what it took till 2-3 years ago to get to the point where we have apps that can tell you, like, when you take a flight or when you're driving somewhere with Google Maps, what the emissions are. So you can measure it. So because you can measure it, in theory, it's easier to brag about the impact. But the question is, what else isn't being measured?
Yeah, and I think one of the interesting unintended consequences of the decarbonization is that it's now become a competitive feature for manufacturers and vendors throughout the supply chain. But if you talk to the carbon accounting professionals, and there's a gentleman that lives up in the north of England named Rich Kenny, who's absolutely brilliant. He's got a company called Interact, and he's got one of the best databases. And he focuses on servers and on chips and storage. But looking at some of he did one report on a server, and then he used the different methodologies, the different ways to calculate, whether it's spend based or weights and measures, or there's several. So depending on the methodology and then depending on the database, and the variance he got was ridiculous, like thousands of % difference. Okay, so now you've got all these methodologies, you've got maturity models that allow those further along to be more stringent, as opposed to those just coming on to be less stringent. But everybody's competing on the same field. And so it can be very challenging. I think it's especially challenging for customers to ensure that they're getting apples and apples, which is another challenge, which I'll go back to if you're looking for an exciting place to be within the industry. And by the way, it's not just the data center industry, the automotive industry. I mean, every industry right now is facing those same challenges.
Every industry wants to be a technology industry in theory, right? See, look at the dashboard of an EV. Looks a lot more like a tablet than the dashboard from the car that I learned to drive on.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, we actually had I interviewed Rich Kenny for an earlier
have you?
I guess great advice on a circular economy and hardware reuse and better ways to look at what's going on inside of the facility. So yeah, I'll link that as well.
Well, he is one of the most interesting people I've ever met, aside from what an alpha nerd he is.
Yeah, and I got the impression from him as well. It's part of the reason that he talks and speaks and teaches and publishes, because so much of a part of it is educating and getting people to understand what's truly going on and trying to direct from the expert source as opposed to bias from the telephone game of one party talking to the next about it.
Yeah. You don't have to worry about Rich, cushioning his answers. He will give you the straight truth.
I sense that from you as well. So yeah, it was a great interview.
Thank you,
Loren. When you think about what you do on a weekly basis, your weekly routines, your monthly routines, how you work with your clients, what do you envision changing in the next 2, 3, 4 years out?
Well, I don't know that. Number one, I don't have a routine. It seems like every day and every week is a little bit different, but that's okay, because that works well with my ADD and my neurodiversity. But I think, kind of going back to something I said earlier, I think the feelings or the sentiments around sustainability, I think we're going to see it shift from I don't want to say happy, so let me just take an aside. A lot of times on panels, when we're having sustainability focused panels, you'll hear, the moderator or someone say, hey, let's leave with some good stuff. Let's make people feel good. Now, that aside, there are a lot of great things going on. I love Yuval Bashar with ECL and his off-grid hydrogen-powered megawatt data center in Texas. Is it perfect? No. Is it moving the needle significantly in an innovative direction? Yes. That's fantastic. Good for him. And Dean Nelson is the first customer in there with Yuval. So, good for them. But I think we're going to see a sobering within not only our industry, but all industries and regulatory bodies, as we start grappling with the magnitude of what we're doing. And I think you'll also start seeing, we're creeping toward, every time there's another COP, you see more people like, we got to go. Like one of the comments that I heard out of the New York Climate Week that was last month is there was a pretty vocal sentiment there. The tagline of the conference was, "It's time." And there were a lot of people like, no, "It's time" was about a decade ago. It's past time. I think you're going to see a sobering as every year the IPCC puts out another report. And I'm sorry if you look at you have to believe the science, but if you do believe the science and you follow the science, putting out a sustainability report that starts with, in order to stay below 1.5 C, science is pretty much telling us that's in the rearview mirror. So now we got to keep it from hitting 2. So it's going to start getting more important. The science is going to become more reinforcing. And I think we're going to see sustainability discussions get a lot more serious, and they're going to be much more prominent operationally, financially, regulatory, obviously, and in the boardroom as well. And I think investors, I think that's another big one you're going to see coming, is the large investors are going to recognize the risk that they have. And that's where the pressure really comes in.
It's an interesting byproduct with all of this as well. I originally grew up in New Jersey, but I've lived in South Florida for over 20 years. And this particular year has been a rough year for many parts of the state, to say the least, with storms. But it's been about 20 years since there's been so many back-to-back storms like this. There's easily a dozen states in the US that are heavily impacted by monstrously ferocious hurricanes that would have been once in 500-year storms, 50-year storms, 25-year storms a generation ago. And when you hear the discussions coming out of the National Hurricane Center and NOAA, they talk about that the intensity is fueled by the temperature of the water. So the question is, like, the surface temperatures of the water, are they feeding the ability to go from a tropical storm to a monster Cat 4 or Cat 5 in 12, 18 hours? And what are the implications of that with such a large percentage of the US living in areas that could be hurt? And it's not just the Southeast anymore. All the way up the East Coast has been impacted over the past decade. So that could potentially be another area that forces more conversations around this.
Yeah, and unfortunately, there's, and this is where political views and political agendas, I think, sometimes skew the science, and it's frustrating. As a passionate environmentalist and sustainability professional, I of course get frustrated when people refute the science. That the climate change is not tied to man-made carbon, et cetera. And my answer to that is, okay, but we can all get together and agree that an island of trash in the Pacific Ocean, the size of Texas, we can all get together and agree that that's bad, right? We're all going to agree with that. That's not okay. We can look at the degradation of biodiversity, the loss of habitat, and the accelerated extinction rate of species, and we can all agree on that. That's bad. And I do, by the way, I think the bright side of things getting more serious is I hope that everyone is able to come together and agree that this is serious, and we don't have as many debates.
Yep. For sure slows down progress, creates a lot of friction. It's different sides that want to create friction for their own interests. But yeah, just for sure, it slows down progress when this is being debated as opposed to being actioned. Loren, with all of this in mind, I really appreciate what you've been sharing today. Do you have any thoughts on who would be great to interview next that would be especially interesting to our audience of go-to-market professionals, sales, marketing, product, channel partnership professionals, entrepreneurs, founders?
Yeah, well, I think, I've already said one. I think, interviewing Sarah Peterson to understand the legal, regulatory, political side would be pretty interesting. Fabiola Bordino, have you already interviewed her?
No, I have not.
Absolutely brilliant. She was part of the founding team at Start Campus in Portugal. She's since left. She's working in energy consulting, but a very experienced and passionate sustainability expert as well. Another interesting one. How many do you want, by the way?
3, 4, 5, handful.
Sure. Let me just get on LinkedIn and I'll give you all my contacts. No. Well, I don't want to stall. I'll have to follow up because there's a gentleman that works at Uptime Institute who's doing some fascinating research. I'll tell you, here's one, and he's not in the industry. He's actually an academic, and I just saw his presentation yesterday. He's written a report. He's writing a book on the green transition and how it's untenable. Is a gentleman named Dr. Simon Michaud. He's an Australian living in Finland. And I can tell you, you could hear a pin drop for a straight hour during that presentation. His research is amazing. And happy to make introductions to all of them.
Yeah, that would be awesome. Really, really appreciate that. Loren, if someone wants to learn more about you and follow what you're working on, is LinkedIn the best channel to reach out to you?
Absolutely. Okay. Yep. Or Clear Sustainability or Dial. Go to the website and contact me that way. But yeah, I'm pretty active on LinkedIn, and I'd love to engage in a discussion.
Cool. Yeah, I'll make sure to include links to your LinkedIn profile and the websites for both Clear Sustainability and Dial Digital Infrastructure Advisors. But this has been fantastic, Loren. I really appreciate you sharing so generously your expertise. It's been really, really interesting to
absolutely.
get your perspective on an area of the digital infrastructure industry that certainly is very timely, but doesn't get quite as much visibility as it ought to, given the implications. So happy to shine
agreed.
a little bit of a spotlight on this and help some people across full go-to-market teams throughout the throughout the digital infrastructure ecosystem to better understand exactly what's at stake and where their companies fit into all of this, because it's certainly a lot to take in. But yeah, thanks again, Loren. Really, really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Have a great afternoon, Joshua. Thanks.
You too. Take care now.
The Data Center Go-to-Market podcast is sponsored by DCSMI, elevating the role of sales, marketing, and go-to-market GTM professionals in the growth of the data center industry. To stay informed about upcoming episodes, make sure that you subscribe to the Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter on the DCSMI website that can be found at www.dcsmi.com. Again, that URL is www.dcsmi.com.